It's doable. Jeez.
You're definitely a square peg in a round hole.
Oh, I felt so impelled.
Definitely some pegging going on there. I would say banana. If you ever get a nose ring, I think I've seen some that have a banana, instead of the ring.
Cool.
That would be kind of neat.
That would be pretty based. I'd love that.
If you do it, let us know, because I definitely want to see pics.
Pointless conversation.
Banana, you changed, man. Changed.
Yeah. I don't think I like the new banana.
It's funny because when we were getting into our sequels discussion, I was about to say that, I think the biggest issue is capitalism. You end up with games that they could have had an incredible overarching story, but they didn't perform well enough in the first one. They didn't make enough money, so we never got to see the closure. And you see it in the other direction too, where it's this is really popular. Let's drag it out for 8 more seasons.
I did 3. I did 3.
I'm so proud.
Before we begin, the Gamer's Advocate would like to remind you that any episode could contain game spoilers, so watch or listen with discretion. And now your hosts, AMKomnenos, Banana, and Legion. Enjoy the show.
Start the episode. Welcome to the Gamers. Damn it.
Gamers. Yes, definitely.
Fucking crushing it already. 4 words in and we've already f***ed up.
Welcome to yet another episode of the Gamer's Advocate podcast. We're joined with Frozen Banana Hammock Republic.
Not frozen.
Not frozen anymore. We have AMKomnenos.
I thought you weren't going to say me for a second.
Somebody else is here.
We're joined by Frozen Banana Hammock Republic, and today's topic is...
Oh, you have your glasses on. I can see you now. Yeah. Can see you with your glasses off. For today, we're going to be going over sequels. When the sequels don't disappoint, because sometimes we just don't need that sequel and it comes off not so great. But we're going to start off with a real quick game. I'm pretty sure you guys have played this game before. Say something nice about the original Witcher 1.
No.
Oh god. Okay, I think that there's a very easy that's nice to take with The Witcher 1. I think from my short impressions of The Witcher 1 and then my full playthrough of The Witcher 2 and my full playthrough of The Witcher 3, I think it's the worst game of the bunch by quite some distance. However, because it exists, we have The Witcher 2. Because it exists, we have The Witcher 3. Sequels that did not disappoint. Hey, that's the name of the episode. But also, I think it's the one that lets you feel the most like a Witcher as you're playing it. The other games, they can have you feel like a Witcher in the sense of you can prepare your potions and your poultices and you can prepare your curses. But I think The Witcher 1, particularly when you're gearing up to fight sort of end of area boss, I remember that sort of hellhoundish figure. Was it the Bargus or something at the end of the first major act? You're building up the appropriate potions. You're trying to understand this monster before you get there. In The Witcher 3, just as a much more competent action game, you don't really need to. You can just be good at the game. The Witcher 2, as a more competent action game, you don't really need to. You can just get good at the game. The Witcher 1 felt like a more pure witching experience and let you feel more like a Witcher in the sense that it forced you to. The Witcher 3 you can choose to. The Witcher 1 essentially compelled you to play like a Witcher.
Yeah, I will say that as far as the Witcher games, I think The Witcher 1 did a solid job of setting things up, which is kind of unfortunately the best thing I can say about it is that it paved the way for much better games. But I do remember that exactly what Com is discussing, that you almost needed to learn the strategy for the original Witcher. You needed to know which enemies were more appropriate for, your traditional sword, which ones you needed your silver sword, which signs would be most helpful in various combat. I remember a lot of that. I just also remember a lot of terrible voice acting, a lot of unengaging combat, where it's just like, I'm traveling around this area, I don't want to fight enemies, I just need to go talk to this person, and then I'm swarmed by a bunch of enemies that I now need to take out. But I think this was definitely one of those games we were going to talk about on this episode anyway, because it paved the way for The Witcher 2 and The Witcher 3, which are wonderful games. It's just that The Witcher 1 came out, and I think from a gameplay standpoint, it was lacking. The world building and the story they had were solid, but it just wasn't a great game. It was a good book.
Yeah, I don't want to be hyperbolic about it, and what I'm about to say really isn't hyperbole, it's how I feel. I think it's possibly the worst game that I've ever played. It's dire. I don't mean it's the worst game ever. I haven't played a lot of games, and normally if someone tells me a game is bad, I don't play it. This was one of the few games, because I was so excited to play The Witcher 3 when that came out, that I thought I'm going to dive back through and now play through the entire archive. And it was awful. Really, really awful game. So much about it. I remember the amount of times I was just thinking, speaking not as a game designer, the amount of times I was just thinking, I don't know why you would have done this. So many of the decisions that you've made are mystifying to me. They are absolutely just bizarre choices. And I just looked at when the game came out. It came out in 2007. We can't even give it the, it was 1999. You know, we hadn't done this yet. This was, for lack of a better phrase, we knew better.
Well, what the background for that, of course, and I'm going to stick it to that's nice.
Matt.
But I played a lot of Neverwinter Nights, and that's where the Witcher engine comes from, is the Aurora engine. It's heavily, heavily modified. So if you were looking for a Neverwinter Nights experience, it would be even worse. Easily. Yeah, it's just they did what they did because they wanted to create a game that lets you be an action hero, and Neverwinter Nights does not let you do that. It is more or less a game designed for people to create their own dungeons, their own scenarios. I think that's really what BioWare wanted. They wanted people to create their own stories within that engine. And CD Projekt Red has a real close history to BioWare. You know, they're the ones who translated into Polish the Baldur's Gate series, and they were able to kind of open up that audience that now has a very beloved community that's devoted to Baldur's Gate because of CD Projekt. So it was one of those things where they were allowed to use the engine, and so they created the Witcher series with it. So yes, it was a great stepping stone for them, but they also didn't really know everything that they were needing to do. But they spent so much time modifying it that everything else that came along with it, the story stuff they wanted to accomplish, it was just, they had a lot to do, and they didn't really have the ability to do it. So yes, I can say that is a poorly made game that definitely deserves a remaster of some kind, a remake even, maybe. But which I hear they are working on.
They announced a few years ago.
Yeah, but it's not their main thing. There's news in the story that I kind of found interesting. They had an earnings call at CD Projekt, and there is a bonus that the management could receive if, and they've said this, this was a quote from them, but there's an outside chance that The Witcher 4 could be out by the end of 2026. And if so, they would get an additional bonus. And they've said that it is possible that could happen. I don't think they're banking on it, but they said that it is possible. So it's interesting that it's further along than any of us had thought. So, but yeah, The Witcher 1, I think, like I said, definitely deserving of a remake, remaster. The story is pretty good. It's not like The Witcher 2 or 3 where you can, like you said, get good at the game. You can just get good at swordplay or something and take 20 minutes to defeat an enemy, that if you knew how to do the oils and the spells, that maybe would have only taken a minute. But in Witcher 1, you have to unlock certain things. You have to find certain things so that the game unlocks that ability just to face that creature. So yeah, it kind of forces you. It heavy-handed forces you the story so that you can move forward. And that's the part that, yes, I don't like. But the rest of it, I'm okay with. I can play around with that.
Yeah, it's a game that I think it would merit a remake, because the problem isn't the story, the problem isn't the world, it's just the game itself that, to my mind, blows. Like, I really don't have fun with. But there's no reason they couldn't fix that.
So again, today we'll go over sequels, and as we mentioned before, sequels that don't disappoint. I think we've been talking about Witcher for a while. I kind of thought when we said that, I said, hey, maybe I could do a That's Nice on that one. That way we can kind of lead into it. And we haven't really talked about The Witcher 2 or 3 in itself. But I mean, if you guys want to talk about those as well, that's fine. For me, I thought Witcher 2 was a pretty good game. It was definitely beyond my expectations of what I had known from The Witcher or this company. I was like, this is not the game I recognize. This is not the story that I thought was going to happen. Garbage. Yeah. Well, when you first go into Witcher 2 and you're leaving the tent with Triss, I'm like, wait a minute. I didn't even romance Triss when I did this. I was like, how did we get here? I played The Witcher 2 wrong the first time I played it, because I did it so out of sequence. Like, because he's telling the story and you get to kind of like you get to piece together like how you got to this point. And that's just the opening chapter. But I did like all the hard stuff apparently first by accident. I was like, this game's too hard. What is going on? I don't even have this on hard difficulty. I played it wrong. But now I know how the story goes and everything else. It definitely flows. I definitely know what I'm doing. I know how to use the signs and everything in that game. In Witcher 1, it was more of a, like I said, they kind of force you how to play the game. But in Witcher 2, it was more of this natural thing where you could do that. But when you're a low level, you have to use everything at your disposal for you to kind of go beyond. And I didn't do that. But I definitely think Witcher 2 overall was a huge leap forward in making The Witcher a beloved series.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thought, thinking about these game series and how they evolve. And sometimes it's for the worse, sometimes it's for the better. I think The Witcher is one of those rare series where I feel that every game was better than the one that came before it. It's not always going to be the case. So we've got The Witcher 1, which, as I said, I really don't like. The Witcher 2, which I think is a really competent game. It's very good. And then you've got The Witcher 3, which is, I'm not one of the ones who would call it a masterpiece. I think it's more flawed than we necessarily give it, than we perceive it to be. But it's clearly a very, 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 very good game. It's one of the big 9 out of 10 games. So it's interesting that they just sort of kept getting better and really developed on what they managed to do in the past. I think some game series don't do. Mass Effect, I don't think Mass Effect did. I think Mass Effect, for me, I know it's an opinion I share with Legion generally, is that I think 2 is a worse game than 1. And I think 3 is then a better game than both that came before it. So for me, Mass Effect started on this nice level, then dropped, but then found its footing again with the final game. When I say 2 is worse than 1, I still mean I really, really like 2. It's just comparative to what came before it. So my mind went initially to series where I think they just kept getting better. I think that's an interesting thought, because Final Fantasy doesn't keep getting better. It has highs and lows. I think one of the few that I can think of where it continued to improve is Uncharted. Like, Uncharted 1 is clearly a first step into what they were doing, and when you go back and you play it, it does feel quite basic. It feels very much from when it was made. I think Uncharted 2, then, they managed to take it to a new level, and they actually developed on what came before. It started to feel like a very, very modern game. Took away some of the tedium that you might have had with 1. Didn't evolve much in terms of story, but I'm not really expecting it to. It's Uncharted. It's supposed to be fun, and not too much more than that. Uncharted 3, I then thought, was the perfect Indiana Jones game. Until we actually got a pretty good Indiana Jones game, thanks very much. But Uncharted 3, I thought, took another level on top of that. And just refined the gameplay. It wasn't night and day between 2 and 3, but it stepped up again. And then Uncharted 4 somehow was better again, because even though I don't think the gameplay evolved much between 3 and 4, what did evolve was that thing earlier I said I didn't want, was the characterization, which suddenly they gave us Uncharted 4 with people who I started to really give a shit about. And I wanted them to be happy, and I wanted them to get out of this. And I didn't want anything bad to happen to them. And they just kept getting better. Uncharted, I think, for me, is the prime example of the series that just kept growing and kept improving.
6.5 hours later.
Yeah, I I would love to add to that. I've not played Uncharted.
Yeah.
That's a really rough one, but I mean, from that description, it sounds like it's a solid series, and I think that's kind of an issue with this topic that I've been having is trying to identify a sequel that's not part of a large chain of games where they have plenty of opportunities to learn from past experiences. Trying to find a game that's, they only made two and the sequel is a huge improvement. It it seems like it shouldn't be possible because if they made a huge improvement in the sequel, they probably went on to keep making games. So you see that it's going to be tough to identify a game where it's one or two entries in the series and the sequel delivers in a way that really satisfies the audience because you're expecting that developer to go on with that series. And I think Red Dead, that's probably the one. That's
Yeah.
probably the game where the sequel delivered. Everybody is satisfied with it. They're happy with the continuation, and then for now there's not another follow up in that series. It feels like it's closed.
That is such an interesting choice for them to go as a prequel as number 2.
Yeah.
I would have never thought that in a million years.
I didn't know what they could do initially when I was hearing about it, because I found myself thinking, right, sequel doesn't make sense because the timeline is just so odd at that point. We've seen essentially the death of that life. We can't do that. And thematically, it's very, very strange. When you think about how the game ends, certainly for one of the major characters, the idea that the world carries on in their image after, it's very, very odd. So to go into the prequel then, I thought, okay, it's a bold choice, but John's going to be in it, and we're not playing as John. How the hell is this ever going to work? Because I think we might not remember, or maybe we do, but it's colored now by how much we tend to love Arthur Morgan, the character they created there, is the bond that people had with John Marsden when Red Dead 1 came out was incredible. How were you ever going to do that again? That's the lightning in a bottle. And they did. And I don't understand how you can make a game as good as Red Dead Redemption 1 and then make a sequel that's better in every way. I don't get it. It doesn't make sense to me. But my goodness, I'm glad they did.
If you think about it, Banana, there's obviously one that we both have. It's Baldur's Gate, of course. Baldur's Gate 1 was impeccable. It was amazing, and it's so good in so many ways when it came out. That when Baldur's Gate 2, I mean, I had ordered the collector's edition ahead of time. Like, it just I had to have the next version of whatever this was. And I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know if they were going to update the graphics or what was going to happen. I mean, it was essentially the same engine, but they definitely did a lot more with it. And it was so much more voice lines, so much more story in it. And it was... the map overall was not what I was expecting, because in the original Baldur's Gate, you have all these various sections, like 24 different areas, something like that, 23 different areas. And you just went to it, and then that was the map there. And then within that map, you might have like a dungeon or a cave or something, not very big. And the way Baldur's Gate 2 did it was that there was like sections. And I wasn't like, I was infinitely disappointed when I got out of Athkatla, because I thought, oh, I'm going to see this huge area that and it was not there. And I was like, this can't be right. But what they did, there's definitely a lot more there. It's all hidden within clusters within that area. And that's where I wasn't expecting. Nobody explained that to me. Of course, this is back in the day of, Gamers magazine, like, what was it, Computer Gaming World. They didn't tell you all this stuff. They just said, here's the game, then, and this is what we think is going to happen. And so you went into that area, and it was a cluster of maps. So that was great. And I was like, oh, so it's not a less content. It's more content compressed in these areas. But yeah, Baldur's Gate 2 is just, there's just so many. The enemies are better. The characters are better. The The arcs that you fulfill are better. It's just the spells and the mechanics are just more fleshed out. It is the perfect isometric game for me. I know there's lots of great isometric games out there, and if I say something's a 9 out of 10, it's really in comparison because Baldur's Gate to me was a 10 out of 10. Baldur's Gate 2. Mm-hmm. So, but yeah.
Baldur's Gate 2 is definitely one of those ones that seems to take everything from the first game and improve upon it. And so it's interesting because when we first brought up this topic, I had my natural, negativity swirling around. And I was like, I'm going to struggle to think of, sequels that actually did it better and didn't disappoint. Now that we're talking about it, there are plenty of them. And for me, there's another entry that now has more than just the 2 games, but does exactly what Baldur's Gate 2 did with the previous entry. It takes everything from that game and improves upon it. And for me, that's Borderlands 2. The original Borderlands was a solid game, but if you try to go back to it now, it's slow and a bit clunky, and it has its issues. And then if you go to Borderlands 2, it might not hold up as well against modern shooters, but it's a very solid game. There's not a lot that's wrong with that. There's not a lot of stuff that's going to turn you off from going back and playing it now. It feels like it still works. And it's just a really enjoyable experience. It takes a lot of the tedium out of the original one. It delivers in characters, in development, in gameplay mechanics, in new and exciting guns. And there's just that kind of that thread that goes all the way through Borderlands 2 of just the sense of humor that makes that entire game a fun experience. So even in those moments where like maybe you have to do something a little bit tedious, somebody will make a stupid joke at some point and you'll be like, hey, this is fun. And now even the little tedious elements are enjoyable. So I think overall that game did something incredible, moving from Borderlands 1 to just a completely fleshed out, fully enjoyable sequel.
I think that's one of those games that really nailed the fun aspect of gaming. It's a game where ultimately that's what it boils down to. They remembered what their purpose was. Now, not every game has to be this. Not every game has to be fun. And one of the next examples I'm going to give for a sequel that I think I prefer to the original, it's not fun. It's very much not fun. But I think for me, it's a more interesting story. But Borderlands, they kept it as simple and straightforward as they could in that department. This was always their leitmotif. This was always their line running through the whole game, was no matter what we're doing, it needs to be fun. There needs to be a point where you don't want to put the controller down. So we're going to make it really colorful. We're going to give it that cel-shaded aspect. There's going to be lots of jokes. Your characters, your sidekicks are going to be goofy. The villain is a bit of a goofball. Horrible, sucks, but a bit of a goofball. All the way through. And even the more serious tones are so tore through with levity that there's never a moment of, I think I need a break. Then I'll take that chance then to dive in with the one that I was just suggesting. And this is one that I think most people won't agree on. And it's not one that I would die on the hill that I think it's a better game. In fact, I don't even think it necessarily is a better game. But I think the story is much more interesting than the first. And that's what I really enjoyed about it. But I think The Last of Us Part 2 didn't disappoint me in the slightest. I thought it was incredibly bold. I thought it was kind of wild what they did. And we're going to talk about, and we won't get into it too much. I think it is a game that I'd love to leave as unspoiled for people as possible, because I think it's very special in that regard. But some of the big moments they take early in the game, the main choice they take for the narrative that you're going to follow for a good half of the game, the way that they try to make you sympathize with certain characters who you might not try to sympathize with, the way that you begin to realize, now, are you right? Maybe, maybe not. But the way that you realize over the course of your journey that your journey might not be worth it, that's not fun. That really shouldn't make a good game. But it was so interesting and different and bold. I want that from my games. Not every game has to be that, but I want games to exist that do that. And the fact that they did that in something like The Last of Us, I think that's great, because this means that it wasn't just my artsy little game that no one played taking a bold risk on a sequel. This was one of the great era-defining games, The Last of Us, that essentially gave you don't know what you want as gamers. We're going to make what we want, and it's up for you to decide whether you like it or not. And that is fucking bold. It's brave, good.
Yeah.
More of that.
Yeah, it's story driven, and so they're telling a story. So they have the right as the storytellers to say it how they wanted to say it, and I think that's a lot of it has to do with that. Because again, you can dislike certain aspects of a game because of maybe the combat or this or that, but if they're telling a story and they get the message across, then it was successful. And I think that's where they kind of planted their flag and say, this is our story. This is where we're going to tell it. And that's why it had to be made. You couldn't leave it hanging the way it was. We all needed the part 2 of that. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't think any of us, after playing the first one, expected what they did. Really, I didn't want it. It's not what I wanted, but I'm glad they did it. And to me, that is always going to be the standard bearer. And this is just me liking it. If you don't, that's fine. It is fine if you don't like it. But for me, that is going to be the standard bearer of games for when I say, as I routinely say, you shouldn't ask gamers what they want. Because we're going to give you the same old shit that we've done 1,000 times. At least this was different.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's one of those that, and it's funny because that is a very polarizing game because a lot of people don't like part 2. They're like, it wasn't as good as part 1. What about it did you not like though? Was it the story? And if it was the story, that's where they planned. Did you like the combat? Did you like the mechanics of it? If all that was good, what really are you not liking here? And maybe a little bit more that you're saying here than
I get it. I get it. Like still keeping it as vague as possible, but you're going to play a huge portion of the game as a character you don't want to play as. I can see exactly why you don't want to, and it's fine. There is nothing wrong with saying that you don't want to, and you didn't like it because you had to play as that character. That is perfectly fine. Perfectly okay. I wouldn't want to play an entire Call of Duty game if the entire game was the no Russian level. I don't want to play the whole thing. Hell no, because I don't want to come out feeling the way that I did, and I don't want you to try and make me sympathize with those guys, because I'm probably not going to. It's fine. But I'm so glad they did it, because that's what we should do sometimes. The big thing that I like about The Last of Us Part 2 is it is a very clear, demonstrable game where if a character does something that should have consequences, it has them. And I think too often in games, we don't do that. Too often in games, in film, in books, we'll put our characters in situations that they shouldn't have an easy way out of, and then we find a way out. We Deus Ex Machina a way out, or everything just turns out okay. The Last of Us, I think, is one of those games where a bit like the Game of Thrones books, where characters will die who you don't expect to die, but, well, look at what they did beforehand. They kind of had to. I think that's what The Last of Us did. It is a game about consequences that showed consequences.
I think I was going to ask you guys in terms of sequels, because we're heavy-handed on the RPG side, so we're like, oh, that wasn't as good because I didn't like it because of the story, it didn't make sense, or I liked it because the story fit better, whatever. But there are sequels of all different kinds, of course. We have RTSs, and I'm thinking Diablo 2. Diablo 2 is still the pinnacle of RTSs now. There's better mechanics that have come out since then, but we all kind of gravitated to Diablo 2. Without Diablo 2, then the rest of these don't exist. But I mean, anything really could be a sequel. If, for instance, like Power Wash 2 just came out, and you were saying, I don't see what else they could have done that would make it any better. I've seen some things that they have changed that are fundamentally different, but it's still the same. You're still power washing. But I guess my question would be, what would be defined as a genuine sequel? Because something can just be a part 2 and not necessarily be a sequel, Not necessarily a line in the sand, but would you say that this would define it more as a sequel, or just really just the second version of the same game?
I think there could be, but I think we haven't drawn it. There very much
Yeah.
could be. We could establish rules, and you definitely could. And it could be, it has to be in the same series. You could even go as far as saying it has to be numbered. You could go as far as saying it has to be the same studio, because of course we do see sometimes studios changing whilst a game is in development. You could say there has to be timeline consistent. You could say that anything like Kingdom Hearts, maybe they're not really sequels because of the way that they play with their narrative. You could definitely establish criteria. I just think we haven't.
Yeah, I was definitely thinking like one of common my favorite series, like Final Fantasy is 8 a sequel to 7? No.
I just wrote down about 10 minutes ago, sort of brainstorming, how do you think about that game as sequels? And in my mind, it's a game where it's a series of non-sequels that may then have sub-sequels. In the sense that Final Fantasy X has Final Fantasy X-2, Final Fantasy 13 has 13, and then the sub-games, Final Fantasy 7 has 7, and the associate games, but are they sequels? Is Crisis Core a sequel? I wouldn't say so. Remake, on the other hand, I'd say actually
Definitely
kind
not
of is.
a sequel, maybe a prequel, but
Yeah.
again, slightly disconnected, very different gameplay.
Yeah. So it's hard. It's very series dependent. I think for the purposes of our conversation, there is almost nothing that narrows down what's a sequel beyond does it essentially have the same kind of name? And that's really it. Does it take place in the same world? And I think a series like Final Fantasy goes a long way towards showing how awkward it can actually be in gaming to define sequel if we really want to be narrow.
Yeah. I mean, especially for our purpose of just kind of generally discussing, I don't think we need to draw a fine line between them. Because I would think, like, very technically, Legend of Zelda games are not sequels. They, up until Skyward Sword, there wasn't even any kind of connecting thread through all of them, and they're very different from game to game. So, like, technically not a sequel, but we can definitely discuss them in the context of entries in a series. So they are sequential. So we can make statements.
Didn't we say that Zelda 2 was technically, before the more recent games, the first timeline game? It's kind of like the Red Dead 2. I think it predates Legend of Zelda.
I'm not sure, because I feel like there wasn't a connection at that point. They didn't really establish a timeline and say there's any link. And then they got to Skyward Sword and they were like, oh, they're all connected. It's always the same link, more or less.
Yeah, I was thinking that was different because I know Zelda, it doesn't become the original. She's remanifested as a different Zelda throughout the timelines. Anyway, and that,
I wanted to actually on the same note, just on the broadness of sequels in gaming, and this one isn't a sequel. But in my mind, I often think of it as the sequel that we deserved. Is a game like City Skylines, which in my mind is
that's exactly where I was going with.
4.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to go with, because I'd hate for somebody to call us out saying you only talk about the RPG stuff. There are other sequels and some are better than others, and City Skylines is one of those that I just don't think is as good as the first one. And I really didn't like the first one, to be honest. I mean, I played it.
Oh, we meant differently. I meant that in my mind, City Skylines is the sequel to SimCity 4, even though it's from an entirely different fucking studio. It's just the inspiration is so clear there between the two, and then the sequel by Maxis to SimCity 4 was so disappointing that it almost feels as though if you think of a direct line between each sequel, so we've got SimCity 1, straight line, SimCity 2, straight line, SimCity 3. From SimCity 4, there's this dotted line, this hashed line going off to City Skylines, which then takes up the legacy. And like I say, it's clearly not a sequel because it's an entirely different studio, but there's so much inspiration there that it almost, in my mind, that's how I think of it. It's the sequel that Maxis never gave us.
I was thinking more literal, like City Skylines and City Skylines 2. We went in two different, but that's exactly what I mean. It's like I think it's important just to say what we mean by sequel, but that's a very important tie that mentally we see the connections and we can associate that type of gameplay experience to say, yeah, that's the spiritual successor to this issue. Yeah,
that's the term, the spiritual successor. Yeah, which is definitely not a sequel, but there's so much common ground there. I think the problem with the spiritual successor as a concept is if we take it far enough back, we essentially end up with every game being a derivative of a very, very small handful of games. We all bow down to the legacy of Mario. We all bow down to the legacy of Tetris, ultimately.
recently, but Banana, and if you don't know, on our Discord, he posts when games go for free on various sites. He has it on his own Discord. And he has it on ours. Yeah, he's a hero. And I noticed Amazon was on there, and I immediately had to make a comment about that. I was like, Amazon is great. That is an amazing game. It's very hard to play nowadays because it's in that Myst era, and they didn't really do a remaster of that like they've done for Myst. So it's in that old janky style. But the guy who did that, unlike Peter Molyneux, we've talked about him and how he makes great concepts for games, but he doesn't always make great games. He is the guy who did that. Is what is his name? Benoit Sokol, I think that's his name. Anyway,
Sure.
But anyway, he started with Amazon, and then he went on to make the Siberia series, and the Siberia series is directly tied to the Amazon, and it got my attention because I was like, why is Amazon out of the blue on sale? Well, apparently they are making a new Amazon, brand new, coming out this year. I was not on my radar. So I'm going to be interested in seeing that because as someone who's very familiar with the Myst series, which I'm going to come full circle here. I'm going to talk about Riven as a sequel, but as someone who's very familiar with the Myst series, Amazon was great for its time, and it was a hidden gem that definitely needs some kind of remaster replay. And I'm thinking this is really going to take that because it's called Amazon. It's called Amazon: The Explorer's Legacy. Wouldn't be surprised if it's some kind of remake, remaster, kind of similar to what they did with Riven. But Riven, for me, was always the better version of Myst because Myst was a great story and a lot of times people just got stuck on that first because back in the day it was more of a slideshow. We had it on CD-ROM. It was kind of cool. It had these really nice pictures. Very few people knew it was even a game. But when you kind of did everything, you realize, oh, there's a story here. And so you kind of unlock this, you unlock that. It was very hard to kind of get into. Riven, on the other hand, it was much more of a gameplay experience. And so a lot of the scenes and the interactions that you had are very memorable. To me, Riven's always been a masterpiece, a 10 out of 10 for sure. Whereas Myst, I would say 8.5. It was great for what it did, 8.5 out of 10. But Myst is always the one that gets all the fame and popularity. But Riven is really the game of choice. But yeah, I was interested because I saw Amazon on there. So who knows? Maybe I'll pick that up and do it as a showcase for our channel.
The people can
definitely
The people can
looking through my game library, and a lot of the sequels that I can see that like I definitely appreciated and they didn't disappoint. There's a follow-up. There's, a third entry or a fourth or a long-running series from those. But oddly enough, the ones that like I think you guys have mentioned that you genuinely appreciate, of those, I'm seeing Knights of the Old Republic. That didn't become a long-running series. I mean, they have their MMO, so maybe that's why. But I can't speak to it tremendously, but from what I've heard of your playthroughs, that sequel is solid. That does not disappoint. And it's the sequel. It's the end. It's not, entry 2 in a 7-part series.
Yeah, I thought it was a strange game, Knights of the Old Republic 2. And I'm not one of the people who thinks that it's a better game than Knights of the Old Republic. I think Knights of the Old Republic just had something running through it that felt more complete, which I believe is what Knights of the Old Republic 2 is very famous for. It's the feeling that this is 90% done, this is 80% done, but something's not quite right. And I often had the feeling while I was playing the game that, yeah, it didn't quite feel complete. And for me, that gives me an almost uncanny valley feeling with games. That idea of this is good. Why does it feel weird? This is really good. And it's just that feeling of, oh, something wasn't quite right. Something wasn't quite done. Props to me, by the way, for correctly using Uncanny Valley. The idea of Knights of the Old Republic 2, I think, was terrific. With a little more time, it probably could have been a game that would have gone on to be really, really genre defining. It's not far off already. And I think Knights of the Old Republic 1 already is genre defining. But it could have been genre defining and genuinely been the catalyst and the continuation then for an ongoing series of further games in that world. But I'm glad it wasn't, because we got Mass Effect.
Yeah. Well, KOTOR 2 was put out by Obsidian. And the reason why BioWare stepped away from KOTOR 2, because they had the opportunity to make it, was that they said they had 10 months to make the game. They said, nope, we're not doing that. They walked away. And so Obsidian said, we'll do it. So given the opportunity, give them 20 months. Who knows how good KOTOR 2 could have been. But they were given 10 months. That's what you get. Mm-hmm.
Interesting, because I was looking at that and seeing the KOTOR 2, and I definitely remember that being well received, but I know there is that kind of which one is better, and that's a kind of ongoing debate with those two. But then that made me think of Jedi Survivor and Fallen Order, and I think that's another. It's not really the same series; it's the same IP, but that's another game where the sequel delivers. That it doesn't disappoint. People were pretty happy with that. And I've played Fallen Order, but I haven't played Jedi Survivor. I've watched playthroughs of it, and it definitely looks like it delivers. It definitely seemed to me like this was a lot of polish on the first game. This was a continuation that really lived up to the legacy established in the first game.
Yeah, there were some tech issues when it first got released, so it wasn't happily received, but the story never suffered. The combat's great. It's, for some people, it's harder in the second one, but by that point you should be pretty proficient with what you're doing over and over.
The get good commentary now.
Yeah. Because it takes a lot of Souls inspirations. It's like you can lose all your experience and health or whatever when you get defeated, and you have to go back and face that same thing again. There's some Souls there, but it's definitely not Souls heavy. It's not nearly like that.
Yeah, I was just thinking about sequels and what we expect from them and what we want them to be. So I'm thinking of a lot of the games that we've mentioned: Mass Effect, KOTOR, Zelda came up. We've had, goodness, I can't think of other ones now. I'm drawing a blank. But we're tending to find games that really, Red Dead, they're very consistent from game to game. And I'm curious about sequels where they actually just completely changed what the game was and what the game was supposed to be, and how much we want those, how interesting those are, or whether we would just prefer for our games to be really doing the same thing but just evolving step by step. God of War. So the original trilogy to God of War Modern, I don't know what you call it, but God of War Modern. Fallout to Fallout Tactics to Fallout 3. And I believe there's Fallout 2 is somewhere in the middle. I think Tactics might have been after Fallout 2, I can't remember. But we have very distinct evolution between those games. Fallout Tactics, you could see, I think, much more the legacy of Fallout 1 and 2 in that. It feels like them, just slightly different. But then Fallout 3 is just another world entirely. We've now adapted Bethesda's entire approach. Gears of War, odd choice, but if you think back to Gears of War and the kind of game it is, let's not forget there's also an XCOM-like a Gears of War game, which is a completely different path to take us down. And oddly enough, doesn't feel to me like a sequel to Gears of War, even though I guess it kind of clearly is. And then the other one which came to mind, which the obvious one, is Final Fantasy VII to Final Fantasy Remake, which is very different, ultimately, in the final execution. And I wonder how much, not any of these games specifically, but how much do we want our sequels to be different to what came before? And how much do we actually just want more of the same, but done a bit better? Because I can definitely say there is value to both of those things. If I like something better and if I like something that's made well and I'm not sick of it yet, yeah, give me more. But at some point, we need to change. And this is something we talked about very often about Final Fantasy as a series, not the sequels, but from Final Fantasy VII to Final Fantasy VIII to Final Fantasy IX, they're always different. And yeah, there is this thread running through them that you're going to have this turn-based combat. It changes slightly depending on what's happening, but we get this common thread. You're going to have your party of just goofballs running through this fantastical world, but they always play so damn differently. And the world is different every single time, that they don't really follow on from each other in any perceptible way. So the big question: how much do we want our sequels to develop on what came before them, and how much do we want them to essentially burn down and replace what came before them? In the case of The Witcher 2, my goodness, I'm glad they burned it down.
I got the day one early access for Baldur's Gate 3. My son even asked me, he said, are you going to get Baldur's Gate 3? And I said, yeah, of course. Because he knew how big of a Baldur's Gate fan I was. And he's like, I'm surprised, because he knew a little bit about the game coming out too. And I know where his, suspicion was coming from, because it's definitely different. When I got the early access, I started playing it and I said, there's something here. There's definitely, it's a new experience. I was expecting a straight up isometric Baldur's Gate 3. Let's just continue the story somewhere else. And this was so different that I was like, this is a bold choice. This is a very unique choice. And from the time until it actually came out in 1.0, I could see the two sides of gamers who were like, I don't like those old titles. I don't know if I even want to play this because I never played Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, and I'm not going to. And then the other side was like, I like Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. I do not need to play this Baldur's Gate 3 because it doesn't even look like or sound. And I was like, I don't know how they're going to make it, because they're so on complete different sides. And I kept kind of preaching that there is a good game here. There is a great game underneath it all. I'd been playing it since day one. And when I put out some videos for it, I was surprised at how successful they were, because to me, it was just a game that I was playing like any other game. So I'm not opposed to newness or whatever. It's just been my pattern throughout my life, is trying new things. But I think, like I said, Banana can probably attest that Baldur's Gate 3 did something wonderful in its inspiration and its decision to move forward in a modern era. So
I think Baldur's Gate 3 is kind of like the perfect example of where to abandon that tradition and where to move on from what is established in your series. And I think thinking about this and that discussion with Baldur's Gate kind of highlighted for me the points where I want them to try something new and the points where I think they need to not do that. So if I look over, the sequels in my favorite game series, Final Fantasy X to Final Fantasy X-2, the changes in gameplay, they didn't bother me. I didn't have an issue with the combat changes. I loved the dress sphere system and the changing class in the middle of combat. I thought that was incredible. What I didn't like was the narrative differences. And we've talked about this on the show before. I don't really need to go into tremendous detail with it, but I think the character of Yuna from Final Fantasy X was so admirable in so many ways. She was confident and powerful and not aggressive or overbearing at any time. She just had her purpose and was going to work towards that goal and do what she needed to. And then you see her in Final Fantasy X-2 and she feels fragile and weak, and I hated that. I didn't want that character to be broken. I didn't like that about Final Fantasy X-2. So for me, my priorities are, if you're going to continue a story, continue the story. Don't deviate, don't change your tone, don't change the message you're trying to communicate. And I think what that really comes down to is, if you're going to do a multi-part series, have it all planned out ahead of time. And that's a really tough ask. Yeah. I get that you're not going to necessarily get the success in the first part that you need to guarantee a second part. So planning that far ahead might not make sense. But when you do, the narrative is just so much better for it. But gameplay elements, those can change dramatically from entry to entry, and it wouldn't bother me. I don't mind the changes from Final Fantasy X to X-2. I don't mind the changes from Mass Effect to Mass Effect 2. That's a much smaller example, but I think there are noticeable changes in gameplay that will stand out in that initial moment when you load up Mass Effect 2 for the first time, but you get over them pretty quick because it feels like Mass Effect. yeah, it's different, but it's not different enough to break my connect.
If you're going to have major changes in the gameplay, I do think at some point you need to merit them, though. You do need to find a way to actually deserve it. You can't just flip it completely. And Mass Effect didn't. Like you say, it still feels like Mass Effect all the way through. It just feels like we're building on what came before and definitely refining. Mass Effect 1 feels like BioWare's first attempt at that kind of combat. And then they took what worked, took what didn't, evolved, and then 2 is really, really improved. And then 3 is a much smaller change in my mind from 2. I think I often consider them to be almost different games in that regard. 1 stands alone as the kind of game it is, and then 2 and 3 are much more closely tied. And the game that I was thinking of, and it's a sequel that doesn't disappoint. And it's one of those strange ones, because maybe it's not quite a sequel, because it does go into a long line of sequels. But the modern Yakuza series with Ichiban, where they've transitioned over into the turn-based combat rather than the classic Yakuza beat-em-up game when we were playing as Kiryu, I think those are an incredible set of sequels, and they've taken the chance to redefine the main character, redefine the way the game plays, to have us in different locations, meeting a new cast of characters. And they took another big risk and really changed. But thankfully, have now given us a whole new group of modern Yakuza games, which plays so differently to what came before, but are really worthwhile for us to have. And those, to my mind, didn't disappoint in the slightest. I thought that they were incredible games. And then the other that I was going to mention, because I don't think I actually directly mentioned it, but I do think that Final Fantasy Rebirth is one of the better sequels I've ever played in my life. I think it's a really exceptional game that's built on what came before. I'm not going to compare it to the original Final Fantasy VII, because I think it's so far away from that in every way, except for the cast of characters and the story. It's not fair in either direction, because we can't have the technical advantages of 2024, and then we have on the other side the nostalgia of 1997. There's no way it's fair on the two of them. But compare it to Remake, which is the direct sequel to, night and day. It is a completely different level of quality, running all the way through. And it's more of a true sequel in the regard that it builds on what came before, whereas that Yakuza series burnt down what came before and built on top of it. But I think there's nothing they didn't improve on. Except maybe the lighting.
Well, Crystal Dynamics took over the Tomb Raider series. Similar to the God of War, they didn't really want that change because they knew Laura as this one type of character. But if you had been playing the Tomb Raider series, and I'll come back to the hubris part, but if you've been playing the Tomb Raider series, you would have said, hey, look, I don't know about these other characters. Why does Laura have to have a backstory? And if like I said, if you had been playing those things, you'd have seen that there is a story underneath all this stuff. And it's not an amazing story. That's not the main part of it. It's the puzzles and stuff in the first 2-3 games. But then once you start getting into like Angel of Darkness and whatnot, then it becomes a really compelling story. So they kind of thought that was going to be the best way to go forward. And nobody really liked playing those games. That's where it lost interest. And so when Crystal Dynamics took over, you would have thought it'd just been like, let's just do what had worked before, but they had changed that. So there was a sense of hubris in the original studios that were doing this because of thinking we can just, give her that story because that story's always been there. We're just going to flesh it out. And that's not what the people wanted. But retroactively, they said, we're going to give you more story. So it kind of works like if you kind of get into it, it's like, you know what, this is our story. And I said this before, like with the Last of Us. This is our story. We're going to tell it. You as gamers may not like this initial introduction or where we're going with this, but just let us cook, as the kids say. Let us cook.
They do say that.
Yeah, they do say that. And I think it was one of those, like Andromeda, again, that's a really hard example for me because I'll never give it credit because I played it to death and whatever. But I don't think it was necessarily a situation where BioWare is just pure hubris. I just think that they didn't have the direction required to move forward with that. I think they truly just, like you said, I don't necessarily know if it's hubris as they were just trusting the process. But you at some point have to like give into it and say, look, okay, Andromeda failed. We're going to make an Andromeda 2 and it will be better. But they didn't decide to do that.
I wonder how much of this is a modern idea. The sequel that doesn't happen. Now, this has always happened. This has been a thing in media since goodness knows going how far back. Twin Peaks, for example, gets cancelled at some point. Arrested Development gets cancelled at some point. Community gets cancelled at some point. Some of these we get reboots of. Some of these we get continuations of. Those three we all eventually do. But they were series that were supposed to be going for X amount of episodes, but for whatever reason, the executives decide, no, we have to stop this now. We bring this to an end. Wrap this shit up. That, I feel, has become a lot more common in the last few years, and this would be particularly in TV. And I think we're largely looking at the influence of streaming services here. The amount of series that start, get one season, get cancelled, they don't go on, but they were planned with these longer narrative arcs in mind. I wonder how much of this gaming is affected by, whether we see games that would have potentially been part of a series that then go on to not be a part of a series, and how much of a risk it is to the art form that we do cut these series off if we have a disappointing entry. We're not getting Veilguard DLC, as far as I know, unless something really changes. And I think that's a shame, because who knows, they could do something interesting there. And if anyone is thinking that, no, Veilguard was bad, it was terrible, they're never going to do anything interesting with that, there's no continuation of that game that could be worth looking at, I draw your attention to The Witcher 1, which is fucking garbage, but gave us The Witcher 2, and gave us The Witcher 3, because the studio was allowed to evolve, learn from what they should have been doing, what they shouldn't have been doing, and then do something different. Cutting them off at the knees like that whenever something goes wrong, and yeah, sometimes we should. Mass Effect Andromeda, I think it is an ongoing disappointment that we didn't get Mass Effect Andromeda 2. Because I want to know, not necessarily where the story was going, but what were they going to do? Because Mass Effect 1 isn't perfect. Mass Effect 1 is a flawed game, especially in the original. Go back and play that, not the Legendary. It's a difficult play. KOTOR is a difficult play. It's a shame that we don't get to see what they could have come up with next for it.
So in BioWare's Discord, there was a thread that was talking about the Mako, and I'm like, okay, I got to talk about this. And they kept saying, like, Mako or a Hammerhead, Mako or a Hammer. I'm like, no, Hammerhead does not belong in, except in a cutscene. But there's nothing at all wrong with the Mako. It was, those planets are designed poorly. Who makes peaks like, this and say, oh, just traverse this just to get to nowhere? That's bad game design on a planet stuff. That's not the Mako's fault. Don't be blaming the Mako. And I got more and more steam going that way, and it's like the Mako's perfect. Leave the Mako alone. But that kind of goes into the, oh no, the Mako's perfect. Yeah, I had heard, speaking of sequels, I had heard that Kingdom Come 2 is definitely, if you didn't like the first one, you will probably like the second one, is what I keep hearing. So,
if you like the first one, you'll hate it.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that a lot of people who like the first one were like, the second one's definitely an easier access. So they liked it because the story is pretty good. But yeah, I haven't had any real detractors from Kingdom Come 2. It's just, to me, it seems like an awfully long game for what it's trying to accomplish. But it's just one of those optional things, glad it exists.
I think games with sequels, weirdly enough, I do find length of those games prohibitive more than I do with a standalone game. If you tell me a standalone game is 50 hours, it's too long. I'm probably not going to play it, but I might think about it. But if there's a game and I know it's got sequels coming and it's 50 hours long, the chance of me playing it is pretty much zero. It becomes such an intimidating ask in terms of time dedication that it would be off-putting. So as soon as I heard the Kingdom Come 2 was actually a pretty damn long game, it genuinely put me off, and it moved that game so far down the rankings of games I might want to play at some point. And I think that's quite interesting to have a different relationship between how long I think a game is allowed to be based upon whether that game has further sequels.
All right. Well, we appreciate everybody being here. I thank you very much for all the insight from Mr. Banana Hammock Republic and AMKomnenos. Catch us on Amazon, Spotify, and Apple Music, Apple iTunes. Anyway,
I just love the idea that, like, episode 50 or whatever, they're still not sure who's who, so Cobb has to point.
Yep. So check us out there, and likes are, greatly appreciated. Comments are definitely appreciated. They help push the algorithm quite a bit.
You said the first syllable of that so aggressively that I thought I'd done something wrong. Comments. What?
Comments are appreciated. com is appreciated, and so are comments. Catch you next time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.